ECPS will record this workshop and it will be made available later on YouTube. So welcome to the 16th and last session of the ECPS virtual workshop series, We, the People and the Future of Democracy, Interdisciplinary Approaches. This online series follows ECPS in-person conference at Oxford University on July 2025 and continues the vital discussion initiated there. I'm Daniela, I'm a master's student in International Relations and European Studies, and today I'm here on behalf of ECPS to guide you through today's session. First, for those who may not be familiar with this workshop, ECPS convenes this virtual workshop series to examine a defining question of our time, that is, how conceptions of the people shape the course of democracy. By interrogating its dual function as a foundation for democratic empowerment and as an instrument of authoritarian consolidation, the series fosters in this interdisciplinary dialogue to advance understanding of democratic backsliding, resilience, and the global future of democracy. Session 16, today's session, is titled Voices of Democracy, Art, Law, and Leadership in the Era of Polarization, and explores how democratic voices are articulated, contested, and defended in an age of deepening polarization. Bringing together perspectives from law, political science, history, and the arts, it examines how disinformation, institutional tensions, rhetorical strategies, and exclusionary identity constructions shape democratic life, from legal battles over electoral integrity and the lived experiences of marginalized actors to the role of state institutions in divided societies, classical populist rhetoric, and contemporary radical right narratives. The session offers a multidimensional reflection on the resilience and fragility of democracy today. As a testament to its commitment to knowledge dissemination, ECPS is going to write a workshop report and share the recording of the event on its website and on YouTube. With this, I move on to introduce the distinguished chair, presenter, and discussants for today's session. Today's workshop is going to be chaired and moderated by Dr. Joni Doherty. Dr. Doherty is Senior Program Officer for Democracy and the Arts at Kettering Foundation. She develops, manages, and evaluates programs involving the intersection of democracy and the arts with the aim of supporting the mission, vision, and values of the foundation. Dr. Doherty's past experiences as a studio artist teaching in the American Studies program at Franklin Pierce University and conducting research at the intersection of aesthetics and ethics have offered her opportunities to work collaboratively together with artists, curators, communities, organizations, and institutions. The first speakers of today's session is Professor Chiara Torres Pellici, who will present a paper titled I Miss My Name, Why Black American Election Workers like Ruby Freeman Turn to Defamation Law to Defend Democracy. Professor Torres Pellici is a Brennan Center Fellow and Professor of Law at Stanford University. She previously served as a counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law and worked as an associate at Arnold and Porter. She has testified before Congress as an expert on campaign finance and has contributed to drafting briefs submitted to the Supreme Court. She is the author of Corporate Citizen, published in 2016, Political Brands, published in 2019, and Corporatocracy, How to Protect Democracy from Dark Money and Corrupt Politicians, published in 2024. The second presentation of today's workshop will be delivered by Dr. Niva Golan Nadir on the question, State Institutions in Divided Societies, Religious Policy and Societal Dissatisfaction in the Israeli Military. Dr. Golan Nadir is a postdoctoral fellow at Reichman University. She received her PhD from the School of Political Science at the University of Haifa, where she further completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Division of Public Administration and Policy. She is currently a research associate at the Center for Policy Research, Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy, the University at Albany, at the Institute for Liberty and Responsibility at Reichman University. Her research focuses on a comparative analysis of enduring gaps between public preferences and legal institutional arrangement in democracies. Professor Elizabeth Cosmerato will be the session's third presenter, and she will deliver a paper titled Pericles' Funeral Oration, a Populist Rhetoric for War and Politics. Cosmerato is a professor in History Department at the University of Illinois, Springfield. The fourth and last presenter of today's session will be Dr. Cristiano Gianolla, who will deliver a paper titled The Exclusionary Identity of the People in Radical Right Populism. Dr. Gianolla is a researcher at the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra, where he integrates research thematic line on democracy, justice, and human rights. He obtained a PhD in sociology and political science from Coimbra and Sapienza University in Rome, with a dissertation on Gandhi's democratic theory and a comparative study of emerging political parties in India and Italy. Following the presentation, our discussants, Dr. Justin Patch and Dr. Amedeo Variale, will each offer their feedback. Dr. Justin Patch studies music in American politics, sound studies, East Asian art music, and music in African diaspora. He is currently engaged in two projects, a monograph on the artistic practices of contemporary American populism, and an ethnographic study of sound and religion in the post-industrial areas of the Hudson Valley. His monograph, Discordant Democracy, Noise, Affect, Populism, and the Presidential Campaign, was published by Routledge in 2019, and a sound studies textbook called Remaking Sound, an experimental approach to sound studies, who co-author with Tom Porcello, was published by Bloomsbury in 2021. Dr. Amedeo Variale earned his PhD from the University of East London in March 2024. His research interests focus on contemporary populism and nationalism. During his academic career, Dr. Variale contributed as a research assistant to the development of a significant textbook project on the global resurgence of nationalism, titled The New Nationalism in America and Beyond, co-authored by Robert Scherzer and Eric Taylor Woods. He has written for ECPS before, but he has also published by other, he has also been published by other academic outlets, ranging from the Journal of Dialogue Studies to UEL's Crossing Conceptual Boundaries. Currently, he is also an affiliated researcher for the Center for the Study of Global Nationalisms. Before moving on with today's session, I just want to remind everyone that a Q&A session will follow the discussant's feedback, and participants may submit questions via the chat box or by raising the virtual hand to ask questions live. Each presenter will then briefly respond to the discussant comments or the question raised by participants. That's all on my side, so you can start today's session. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for introducing all of the participants and discussions. I just want to say a quick word about the title of our session today, which was to have focused on art, law, and education in an era of polarization. And so since the presenters who were to have addressed the art part of the session needed more time to complete their work, I'm just going to very briefly bring that in a little bit and connect it to populism. So, you know, populism, the people, is often positioned in public discourse as good. However, you know, populism, the use of that term and the role of the people can be used to manipulate or exclude. And so it's not always simply a good. And the same is true with art. As in the arts, freedom of expression is highly valued, including free speech. But both the arts and speech can be used uh, in ways that are harmful to democracy. They can be used as forms of propaganda and arouse emotions and obscure fact-based realities. So I think that you will see as we proceed with the presentations that each of them address this idea in some way. So in the first presentation, U.S. political leaders are manipulating elections in the U.S. In Israel, the second presentation, the recognition of two highly valued groups, one in the military and then, religious group. Uh, they are both highly valued, and so in some ways, neither of them can claim to be an exclusionary the people because they're weighing two strongly held values in that society um, that couldn't be sidelined. In the Pericles funeral oration, I think that Pericles as a leader is seeking to offset the negative responses to a war that has escalated beyond expectations, which of course, living in the US, I'm thinking very much about um, the conflict that we are involved here, which has exceeded expectations. And so it'll be interesting to see this interpretation of how Pericles uses an emotional appeal to support democracy, even as the actions that he's taken can be seen as authoritarian. The final presentation considers the narrative of emotions used in Italy to claim a democratic ideal based on exclusion, based on identity, the excluding of a group of people because of their identity. So I am asking myself a question, which is, how is the research we are about to hear expose the complexity of both free speech and populism in ways that can help us better understand and respond to contemporary events? And with that, I will turn to our first presenter. You're muted.
Let's try that again. Good morning. Uh, to those of you in different time zones, good afternoon and good evening. My name is Chara Torres Spelisi. I teach law in Florida, and I focus on the intersection between corporate law and election law. And I spend a lot of time on political corruption. But let me start with an anecdote. My father was an African American artist, and when I was a youngster, he would tell me, Chara, remember to ask the big questions. The big question that has animated my work over the past 20 years is what's the proper role of corporate money in a democracy? But more recently, with events in the United States, I've been thinking of, I think, an even bigger question, which is what can help save American democracy? And that led me to write the paper that I circulated for this event. I Miss My Name: Why Election Workers Turn to Defamation Law to Defend Democracy. And I started to write this paper a couple of years ago, and this is one of the perils of writing about unfolding events. Some of the things in the paper have changed in huge ways, which I'll address in a moment. So, normally my focus is campaign finance law, which is a subset of First Amendment law because the Supreme Court has mistakenly equated money with speech. But in this paper, I'm focusing on a different subset of First Amendment law, which is the question of defamation. Essentially, defamation is the publication of a lie that harms a person's reputation. And because of the US Supreme Court's precedent, if the person who has been defamed is either a public official or a public figure, then the plaintiff must show that the defendant acted with actual malice when they said the defamatory lie, which is a very high standard to meet. Defamation is one of a small categories of types of speech that is not protected by the First Amendment, along with fighting words, obscenity, and incitement. So 2 years ago, I published a book called Corporatocracy with NYU Press, and that book is a long discussion of the ways that corporate money has impacted American democracy for over a century, including in the 2020 election, the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, as well as corporate spending in the 2022 midterm. And this book also looks at the many different attempts there were to hold people accountable for their attempts to overturn the 2020 election. Now, I realize a lot of this was international news, and I may not be saying anything that you don't already know, but I also know that I've hit lots of law students who do not really fully understand the scope of the effort to overturn the 2020 election in the United States. And that becomes part of this paper because part of what happened with the big lie. So the big lie is that Trump was the true victor of the 2020 election. And that big lie was embraced by the populist right wing in the United States. And I think it's a very seductive myth that says your preferred candidate won instead of lost, and that the other side could only win by cheating and trickery. Now, the big lie was made up of other constituent smaller lies and subplots. And so that we're all on the same page, let me explain. There was a multi-pronged approach by President Trump and his inner circle of lawyers to overturn the results of the 2020 election, which he lost. One attempt was to impound voting machines. There was so much internal pushback at the time by professionals that that part of it didn't happen. Then there was the fake elector scheme. So in swing states, the Trump team attempted to send fake electors to have meetings. They actually send certificates up to the National Archive. And these fake electors came from Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And the plot was to get the vice president to accept those fake electors over the real electors. Then there were attempts to pressure state officials to either manufacture non-existent votes or to call their state legislatures into session to have the state legislatures overturn the will of the people in their respective states. This included testimony by Rudy Giuliani, who testified in front of the Georgia legislature and the Pennsylvania legislature, where he would repeat defamatory lies about two particular election workers in Georgia named Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss. And I think one of the reasons so many people believe these lies is that they were told in a situation where normally you're under oath and are forced to tell the truth. Another prong of this plot was the challenge to the results of elections in court in swing states. This formally failed. It took over 60 litigations, some of which bounced off of the US Supreme Court. The US Supreme Court largely sidestepped most of these efforts and dealt with them either with cert denials or by declaring the cases moot after President Trump had left office. But once again, lawyers for Trump repeated defamatory lies about Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss in these filings. And lawyers have a duty of candor with courts. And I think another reason why these defamatory lies were believed is that they were in court filings, where usually one would find factual and truthful statements. And we know all of this in part because of the investigation that was done by the January 6th Select Committee in Congress and the two failed attempts to prosecute Donald Trump One was federal, that was the Jack Smith special prosecutor attempt that turned into US versus Trump. And then there was an attempt at the state level in Fulton County, Georgia, that became Georgia versus Trump. And in the Georgia case, there were a lot of co-defendants. But both of these prosecutions ultimately failed. The Georgia suit was ended last year in 2025. And the Jack Smith prosecution first resulted in the very troubling Trump immunity decision from the Supreme Court. And then ultimately, this prosecution was ended by the 2024 election. And Jack Smith voluntarily dismissed the charges so that he could write a final report and so that he could avoid a long-standing DOJ policy that sitting presidents cannot be prosecuted. Uh, so, I think if we step back and look at all of that, uh, the attempts to hold people accountable through the criminal justice system just largely failed. And I think only two things were successful in holding some of these bad actors accountable. One was an effort to disbar some of the lawyers. And so some of the lawyers involved were sanctioned, some had their law licenses suspended. Uh, Rudy Giuliani is was disbarred from both New York and DC, and just yesterday, John Eastman was disbarred from California. And I think that is a real type of accountability. But one of the only other areas of law that I think functioned was the tort system and defamation lawsuits by election workers against some of the individuals involved. So one of the things that I focus on in this paper is uh, Freeman and Ross and Moss, sorry, uh, sue Rudy Giuliani for defamation for his repeated lies about them. And one of the things really Giuliani did that was so damaging is he put out an edited video of these two women, which made it look like they were up to no good. But this was not a deep fake, it was a cheap fake, but it was wildly effective because it got played on cable news and on the internet, and people just believed what they saw. And they didn't think about how it had been manipulated. But uh, Freeman and Moss sue OAN, Giuliani, and Gateway Pundit. And in the Giuliani case, in part because he would not give them discovery, he ends up essentially with a default judgment against him. And the jury in that case awarded nearly $150 million to these two election workers from Giuliani. And there was a time when Giuliani declares bankruptcy. He uh, is being forced to hand over the keys to his apartment, the keys to his car, all of his watches, sports memorabilia. And then suddenly, someone, we don't know who because it was private, swoops in and saves Rudy Giuliani. And so, what press reports have said is that the election workers were compensated, but they were compensated in a way such that Rudy Giuliani did not have to give up all of his things anymore. And there was a period after that verdict came down where Giuliani continued to defame these uh, workers. But when the settlement happened, I sort of suspect that whoever paid off Giuliani's debts also said to him, I'm not going to pay for this twice. So he suddenly stops defaming them when they come to a full settlement. Now, I had really hoped that these uh, defamation lawsuits would have gotten farther in the courts and not just ended in settlements. But this is the problem with working in law. You have to work with how the cases really do come out. What I had hoped is that this set of cases where the defamation was sort of so egregious that it might have given courts a ability to clarify and possibly modify the uh, actual malice standard from New York Times versus Sullivan. But because of these settlements, we don't get that ability for the law to change and evolve. But what I hope that the large jury award, the 150 million, I hope that that stands as a warning to other would-be election deniers
Three
that there
minutes.
that there are consequences for such egregious behavior. And you can read the paper to see all of the horrible things that happened to these poor women who were just helping to count votes during a pandemic. And they did nothing wrong. And their lives were turned completely upside down, and it became racialized very quickly because they happened to be African American women. And so, it's like threats of lynching and things like that. And I hope that it stands for the proposition that there are still parts of law that can hold people accountable. And I hope that in the future, defamation remains an open door for people who are harmed, who do the thankless work of running American elections. So thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much. We're going to move quickly on to our next presentation by Neva Golan Nadir. So I'm going to turn it right over to you because we're pressed for time.
Thank you very much. So the topic that I want to talk to you today is state institutions in divided societies. The specific topic will be religious policy and societal dissatisfaction in the Israeli military. Okay, so I come from political science. I understand that we're an interdisciplinary group. So I would like to focus my stand here. I'm going to talk about democratic theory, specifically the democratic process. Basically, when we are talking about the democratic process, we are talking about institutional designs. The institutional designs basically are the policies that a state has. And we expect that when there's a loss of legitimacy for these arrangements by the people, we will see civil dissatisfaction that will result after the voicing of the discontent in a change of policy by the democratic institution. Nonetheless, there are many cases where we face democratic deficits. And what does that mean to us as to the process? So we do have institutional designs, but many times they carry with them some kind of a policy barrier for change. When they lose their legitimacy by the people and we face social dissatisfaction, the policies, the institutional designs, many times simply do not change. And these gaps can be enduring gaps for a long period of time, sometimes still standing still. There is an enduring gap, but the institutions remain stable. So the reason I would like to suggest today would be the mutual social dissatisfaction in a divided society, namely different groups in society feel differently about the policy, yet not in an extreme way, extreme enough to cause some kind of a conflict that will result in a change, a certain change. We don't know to which direction, but still as change. So we are at status quo. So I'm going to take you to the Israeli case study and specifically to state-religion relations, state-religion issues. So basically, Israel is defined as a Jewish and democratic state. It means that Israel, to a large extent, yet not completely, does not separate religion affairs from the state institutions that are supposed to be secular. So there are, historically based pre-state arrangements that were set by David Ben-Gurion back then in 1947. He was the head of the Zionist movement in Europe and, of course, headed to be the first Israeli prime minister. And he said to the representatives of Agudat Israel, the Orthodox movement in Europe, he told them, we must, now after the Holocaust, we must form a state to the Jewish people. And, well, if we're facing the United Nations, the organization, we cannot say that we are a divided society that will perhaps fight after we get a state, but we must present a unified front. Hence, us, the Zionist movement, we guarantee that religion will be incorporated in state institutions, in the public realm, by the way, not in the private realm, in 4 areas of policy, the ones being Shabbat, the Jewish rest, day of rest. So there's no commerce on the Shabbat, there's no public transportation on Shabbat. Kashrut, keeping kosher food in public institutions. By the way, this includes universities. Marriage in Israel, there's only religious marriage. By the way, equality is kept. Each religion, each denomination have their own kind of marriage, but it has to be only religious. And education, each stream of each religion and each stream of Judaism has its own education stream. Nonetheless, this does not end here. State-religion relations actually incorporate many other components. So this goes to burial, conversions to Judaism, even autopsy. And one of the burning issues at the moment because of few years of ongoing wars in the country, we're talking about conscription, namely having the ultra-Orthodox men serving the mandatory service in the Israeli army that is now lacking 80,000 soldiers in order to be at its capacity, stressing the ability of the secular community to serve for such great and long period of time in ongoing wars. So just a little bit about demographic. This is official statistics by the Central Bureau of Statistics in Israel. So currently, 73.5% of Israelis are affiliated as Jews. It has reduced. This is self-definition. 44.2 declare themselves non-religious secular. 32.7 are traditional, a very fluid definition. They keep some of the religious commands, if you may, but it is what they choose to do. 11.5 are religious and 10.8 are ultra-Orthodox. Namely, 22.3, as you can see, are definitely can be defined as highly religious populations. When we try to examine the sentiments of the Israeli population, of course, all levels of religiosity included in surveys, we see that Israelis are mostly dissatisfied with the entire span of religious policies. So you can see that 58.3 are dissatisfied with having such great religious policies in state institutions. Of course, roughly 90% are secular, over 50% are traditional, 16.7 are religious, and of course 0% ultra-Orthodox, since this is definitely the route for them to go and have the state to be as religious as possible. I'm going to talk a little bit about theory concerning state institutions, religiosity, and divided societies. So what does that mean, a divided society? It means that the ties within the population, either political or ethnic or linguistic as in Belgium, or religious, as in Israel, as in Lebanon, create some kind of antagonistic segmentation within society. In Israel, we have the private case of religion as the source of conflict. We're talking about confessionalism. It is a democratic state where cleavages are usually based upon religion. But basically, these institutional arrangements, when we're talking about this kind of society, they involve power sharing, having the different groups have proportionate representation in state institutions. Religion, as its face value, takes an institutional form, specifically when religion is implemented within state institutions. So we see the democratic states and democratic institutions actually embed the religious departments, the court. Everything is incorporated into the government and the different institutional arrangements of the state, making definitely religion be a very core part of it. Now, when there is one representation of religion, it has become some kind of a monopoly, an institutional barrier. In the theories, the realm of the economics of religion, we see the governmental regulation holds a critical role in shaping religious trends and events, and definitely if religion is only offered in a certain way, we will have a great barrier to other groups in society to feel that they have their needs met, or they feel affiliated with their state's policies and institutions. So basically, what is the question that we were asking here? So assuming that we have a state institution in an heterogeneous society that holds a single policy that applies to the diverse groups in the society. So we're asking, how do military institutions maintain social cohesion and legitimacy when implementing religious policies in divided societies? And of course, within this process, maintaining operational cohesion. Our hypothesis, we refer to it as the balanced dissatisfaction hypothesis. We argue that when religious policies produce similar levels of dissatisfaction across the groups in this divided society, militaries retain higher level of cohesion and legitimacy than when policies disproportionately burden a single group, hence maintaining also the operational cohesion of the organization. This challenges the conventional civil-military relation approaches that argue that preference satisfaction is the foundation of legitimacy of the institution. So just briefly about the Israeli military, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, it is a state institution. It is embedded in the state's religious policies. It has mandatory conscription, and there's representation from secular, traditional, religious, and also ultra-Orthodox at the fringes within it. The military has its own rabbinate, the Orthodox establishment that governs Israel's religious affairs. And it has a chief rabbi that is appointed by the chief of staffs of the military. They have multiple duties, issuing and overseeing implementation of religious guidelines within the military. Hence, if we can take the Shabbat, keeping of the holy day, so soldiers cannot do things that are not allowed. Just 2 days ago, 3 soldiers were sentenced to prison because they had a barbecue on a Shabbat within their residence. And this is, well, according to the religious guidelines, not allowed. And of course, there's great secrecy around it. The military does not publish this information. Usually it comes from the soldiers and their families. Nonetheless, there's also multiple unofficially regulated practices, sometimes within the officers themselves. If they are of higher level of religiosity, we will see that they implement more religious practices. And well, definitely in the past 2 years, we could see in the Swords of Iron War, the Israel-Hamas war, that religious social associations were trying to insert more influence into the military, more religious influence, highly associated with the notion.
3 minutes left. 3 minutes, Neva.
Okay.
Okay.
So basically, one of the core issues within this conflict is the ultra-Orthodox conscription and the longing of society to have them carry the weight and the burden of service. But we see many differences within the groups in the military. Nonetheless, and I will make this shorter than I would like to, but despite not having their preferences met, we see that there are very low levels of distrust in the military, roughly 10 to 15% for the past decade. But nonetheless, if we see other state institutions like the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, the government, the presidency even, we see higher, sky high to even 80% across the secular segment, for example. Hence, the military does not seem to experience levels of distrust. When asked, do you agree that the IDF holds an equally respectful attitude towards the different groups in society? So roughly 70% believe that yes, the military does represent everyone, even though we know that not everyone's needs are met. Most interesting data is the fact that when we ask which group's needs are met more by the IDF, there's almost an equality between the different groups. 25% say religious soldiers have their needs met more. 28 say roughly 28 say the secular, and 30%, roughly 30% say both equally. This is highly evident when we see this in the logistic regression. You can see that this is a symmetric dissatisfaction across the different groups in society. So, as to the democratic perspective, the military in a state institution and religiously divided society is faced with all-encompassing dissatisfaction among the different groups. No one feels that their needs are met more than the other, despite the dissatisfaction, making this institution highly stable. Religion, as presented here, can be considered as a paradigmatic case study, like any other public policy in state institution, a barrier that creates a conflict within a society. I try to amuse myself with a normative inquiry as to when would the religious barrier cease within the country entirely, but also specifically within the military. And I thought this might cease when the country might face an existential necessity, but as it seems, this was not the case. So the Israeli case definitely demonstrates that managing internal accommodation matters even when external threats are salient. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Neva. Now we're about to do a time travel of 2,500 years back to Pericles' funeral oration. You're muted. Sorry.
Okay, hello everyone. Sorry for that. So the funeral oration attributed to Pericles by the Athenian historian Thucydides in the second book of his History of the Peloponnesian War is one of the most famous speeches to survive from classical antiquity. For generations, it has been read as the consummate celebration of Athenian democracy and civic virtue, and as a defining expression of the political and cultural ideals of classical Athens. In this interpretation, Pericles emerges as the exemplary democratic statesman articulating the values that made Athens great. Yet the speech also deserves to be examined within the political and military context in which it was delivered, and as I will also argue, as a supreme example of masterful populism, delivered by the first Athenian populist leader, the man who introduced the so-called Athenian radical democracy. The oration was delivered in 31 BCE, and at the Athenian cemetery of Keramikos, you can see it here, before the public grave, which you can see here, that's the end of it. At the end of the first year of the Peloponnesian War, Athens had just experienced its first casualties in a conflict that would eventually reshape the Greek world and would bring down Athenian hegemony. The public funeral for the war dead was therefore not merely a ritual of mourning, it was also an event of considerable political significance that I will also argue here could conceivably make or break Pericles' career. And here I should say that Pericles had promised the Athenians that it was an easy-peasy situation. We're going to do it, we're going to go there, we're going to destroy them, we're rich, we have the ships. It's going to be a very short war. Don't worry. Actually, it wasn't a short war. It was 27 years, which ended with the defeat of Athens, its submission to Sparta, and the end of its hegemony, which almost also bankrupted the city. And it did break Pericles' career a year later. Indeed, if we read the speech carefully, we notice something striking. The fallen soldiers themselves occupy relatively little space in the speech. So it's supposed to be about them, and he doesn't talk about them, hardly at all. Moreover, their mothers, wives, sisters, or daughters are strategically and sternly taught to keep decorum because, as Pericles puts it, to a woman not to show more weakness than is natural to her sex is a great glory, and not to be talked about for good or for evil among men. In other words, women who were the spectators more likely to engage in open and expressive mourning should be silent and not make a spectacle of themselves by crying in public, thereby activating dangerous emotional contagion, as Pericles' son found a few decades later. Instead, the overwhelming focus of the oration is Athens itself, its institutions, its character, its place in the Greek world. This shift suggests that the speech was doing something more than commemorating the dead. It was also constructing a narrative about the city and its political identity at a moment when the identity needed to be mobilized for a prolonged and uncertain war, a reality the Athenians only now seem to be realizing. Thucydides preserves 3 speeches he attributes to Pericles, while he also writes the first obituary and profile of a politician in history. Rather than treating these texts as Thucydides clearly wanted, i.e. as the purest expression of Athenian democratic ideals as articulated by the great democratic leader who supported the war, I would like to look into what political work the speech performs at the moment it is delivered. So who was Pericles according to Thucydides? He was Athens' first citizen. As he says, what was nominally a democracy became in his hands ruled by the first citizen. He was wise and calm. Other sources suggest he was often compared to Zeus himself, being called an Olympian, an epithet that may have been used both tongue-in-cheek and in seriousness. He had laid out the foolproof plan for the Peloponnesian War that would guarantee, in Thucydides' view, a victory for Athens. He told them to stay calm, to take care of their navy, I'm quoting Thucydides here, to acquire no new empire and to expose the polis to no hazards during the war, and promised them a favorable result if they did this. Indeed, in Thucydides' view, it was his successors who brought the city's doom. What they did, he says, was totally opposite, allowing private ambitions and private interests in matters apparently quite unrelated to the war, actions harmful both to themselves and to their allies, actions whose success would only produce honor and advantage for individuals, and whose failure entailed certain disaster for the polis in the war. Pericles was a man of prestige and wisdom, a scion of the historic family of the Alcmeonids, whose lives and careers were intertwined with Athens's, a man of manifest incorruptibility who was thus enabled to exercise an independent control over the multitude. In short, a multitude is how Thucydides refers to the unwashed, I suppose. So, Anyway, in short, to lead them instead of being led by them, for as he never sought power by improper means, he was never compelled to flatter them, but on the contrary, enjoyed so high an estimation that he could afford to anger them by contradiction. Where were we? Yes, what Thucydides next says about Pericles in his obituary is the most important assessment of all. Although I'm not sure his intention was for posterity to draw the conclusions I'm drawing today. He writes, whenever he, Pericles, saw them, the demos, the Athenian citizens, unseasonably and insolently elated, he would with one word reduce them to alarm. On the other hand, if they fell victims to panic, he could at once restore them to confidence. So it was the latter reaction of the Athenians that occasioned the contents of the funeral oration, which functions then as a form of political mobilization rhetoric. At this point, after a year of war that did not exactly go as Pericles had predicted, despite his grip on power in the city, the Athenian countryside had already been laid waste by the Spartans. Worse would come in the future. Athenian soldiers had been killed, and even though, according to Thucydides, so abundant were the resources from which Pericles alone foresaw an easy victory in the war over the unaided forces of the Peloponnesians, again, I quote Thucydides, there was also no end of the war in sight. There was opposition. Playwrights like Aristophanes a few years later in his Acarnanians had pointed out the loss of trade and its economic consequences for Athens. It wasn't just the navy, it was also trade. This is therefore why Pericles' funeral oration, rather than merely praising the fallen, constructs a powerful vision of Athenian identity and uses that vision to legitimize continued war. In doing so, it employs rhetorical strategies that modern political scientists often associate with populist political discourse. To begin with, the speech constructs a unified political community. Pericles repeatedly describes Athens as a city unlike any other. The Athenians are presented not simply as inhabitants of a particular polis, but as members of a distinctive political culture defined by freedom, participation, and civic engagement. One of the most famous lines of the speech captures this idea. We cultivate beauty, he says, without extravagance, and we pursue wisdom without softness. Here, Athens is portrayed as balancing qualities that other societies supposedly cannot reconcile. Refinement without decadence, intellectual life without weakness. The implication is that the Athenians themselves embody this unique equilibrium. Furthermore, the Athenians themselves are described in terms usually reserved for a ruling aristocracy in the context of a democracy. The speech thus constructs a collective identity grounded in exceptionalism. Athens is not merely one city among many, it is presented as a model for others. Pericles famously declares that Athens is the school of Hellas, Greece, a phrase that transforms the city into a kind of political and cultural teacher for the Greek world. The construction of collective identity serves an important rhetorical purpose. By defining the Athenians as members of an exceptional political community, the speech dissolves internal differences within the demos, or so Pericles hopes. Social divisions, wealth, status, regional origin are replaced by shared civic identity. The Athenians become the people, united by a common political character or led by an inspired leader with a great vision, even though Pericles carefully avoids talking in the least about himself in the speech. The speech also constructs a powerful moral contrast between Athens and its enemies. Although Sparta is not named directly in this section of the oration, the contrast is unmistakable. Athens is portrayed as open and confident, while its enemies rely on secrecy and rigid discipline. Pericles emphasizes that Athens does not imitate others, but rather serves as an example, and its citizens are unique. We do not imitate our neighbors, he says. Rather, we ourselves serve as a model. This formulation elevates Athens not only politically, but morally. The city becomes the embodiment of a superior way of life. War against such a city, therefore, takes on a broader significance. The conflict is no longer simply a struggle over power or territory. It becomes a contest between political systems and ways of life. Such framing has important consequences. If Athens represents a superior political order, then defending the city becomes synonymous with defending the order itself. The war is thus recast as both necessary and meaningful, and the Athenians lead the war as one. The speech also transforms the meaning of death in war. Rather than emphasizing loss or tragedy, Pericles presents the fallen soldiers as proof of Athens' greatness. Their deaths demonstrate their devotion to the city and confirm the virtues that define the Athenian community. In one of the most memorable passages of the speech, Pericles states, "For famous men, the whole earth is their tomb." This line elevates the fallen, especially those whose bodies were never found, because he also probably came up with the idea of the unknown soldier. The procession to the public grave was headed by the remains of a soldier who was never identified. It's the first time in history that we see this. And here I have, of course, the unknown soldier in Athens today in front of the parliament. So the memory transcends the physical burial place, and physical burial was important for the ancient Greeks and the Athenians and their wives and sisters and daughters and all these people who are going to scream, "You didn't find my loved one, where is my loved one?" Their soul is going to, whatever, wander for eternity. So he mentions that the greatest honor was given to a soldier whose remains were not positively identified. And so the rhetorical move also performs an important political function. If the deaths of the fallen confirm the greatness of Athens, then future sacrifice becomes not only acceptable but honorable. The speech thus transforms individual loss into collective meaning. Private grief is reframed as public glory. Naturally, few people must have noticed that this was an indirect warning by Pericles that the war was going to go on. Nobody knew for how long. The oration also addresses different segments of the audience, and this is important, in ways that reveal a careful management of emotion. Pericles speaks directly to the families of the fallen, urging fathers to take pride in their sons' courage. Widows are encouraged to endure their loss with dignity and restraint. Younger men are invited to emulate the bravery of those who have died, and most curious of all, for us.
3 minutes, please, Elizabeth.
Yes. Bereaved couples still capable of childbearing were advised to get down and do the deed to produce more soldiers for the city. So through these appeals, the speech channels grief into civic commitment. On the other hand, I will just speed up. We can juxtapose it to the other speech, the third speech that Thucydides preserves, where, of course, there is a backlash to all that. And Pericles takes a different stance. He shows his stern face and even accuses the Athenians of basically the war being their fault, because he said, well, I mean, I'm one of you. I just gave an opinion. Who voted for the war? You did. Of course, they didn't buy that. So the juxtaposition of those two speeches raises an intriguing possibility. The funeral oration may represent not simply a straightforward expression of Athenian ideals, but also a moment of rhetorical confidence that stands in tension with the harsh realities that follow. The speech, one of the most eloquent expressions of civic pride in history, therefore occupies an ambiguous place in the history of democratic thought, even though we often forget that it is an example of populism, demonstrating how democratic rhetoric can mobilize collective identity in support of prolonged conflict. In that sense, the speech represents one of the earliest surviving examples of a populist political leader transforming collective grief into political consensus in order to protect his political narrative, one that gave the bereaved his own answer to the eternal question of whether and why loss must be borne, and which made further deaths possible. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. So now we're moving to our fourth and final presentation, and so take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you see my screen and you hear my voice.
I think you have to double click there too. Okay, here we go. Great.
Yeah. So today I'm going to present a paper, actually an article that was published that will give more information soon. The focus is on the exclusionary identity of the people in radical right populism. I thank the organizers and the moderators also for the presentation and the putting together of this panel. The research that I'm going to present is part of a research project that ended a year ago, and that was entitled Unpacking Populism, Comparing the Formation of Emotion Narratives and Their Effects on Political Behavior. We wanted to understand the emotion narrative, which is an heuristic we developed, I'm going to present in this paper, as this is very much connected with the previous presentation, as how discourse enacts emotions and generates and guides political behavior. It was a cooperation between the Center for Social Studies of the University of Coimbra in Portugal and the Center for Research in Neuropsychology and Cognitive and Behavioral Intervention of the Faculty of Psychology of the University of Coimbra. We had an interdisciplinary team, and we used mixed method to collect information and data. And you see the main research question on the screen. The first one was, how are emotion narratives engendered and articulated by populist parties to define in-group, us, and the out-group in opposition to the out-group? But we also wanted to understand what is the impact of emotion narratives in political behavior, and what is the impact on the success of populist parties especially. And finally, we wanted to develop methodologies to be able to study emotions in politics, because we found that the many methodological accounts that existed were to some extent limited for what we wanted to do, that was comparing both supply and demand side of politics. We compared Portugal and Italy, because Portugal was recently a recent case of the emergence of far-right populism. Since 2019 is when the first far-right MP stepped in the Portuguese parliament. While, as you know, Italy is a case of long tradition of populism. So what I am going to do now is to present the research puzzle and elaborate on the heuristic, both theoretically and then looking into how we translate that in methodology to make this study, then analyze some data and come to some conclusions. This article is open access, available on the link you see on screen. So all the data that I'm going to present are available there. I don't think I need to present to this audience data, but I mean, these are here of how the far-right populism is in the rise. Although we had last Sunday's election in Hungary, that may possibly say that at least in that country things are going differently. This is nonetheless disputable, and we will see many publications on that in the near future. But in general terms, even if we look at other studies and reports, namely the VDEM reports, the level of autocratization is increasing every year in the world. So we wanted to understand why this is happening, and we were aware that populism can be studied both as a specter for democracy, its shadow, so something negative for democracy, because it's inherently irrational and undemocratic. But we also look at literature, especially the political philosophy of Ernesto Laclau and other scholar of discourse theory that look at how populism work, rather than defining the effects of populist phenomena and defining populism based on the way they work, the phenomena themselves. And so we wanted to study the emotional side of populism, but not focusing only on what was predominant back then a few years ago. That was the analysis of negative emotions. We understand that people supporting this party, they also have positive emotions, and we wanted to understand which emotions are mobilized, both negative and positive. That's why we focus on the emotion narrative. So to do that, we focus on the question, what political culture and democratic vision do radical right populism entail? Because we understand that there is a connection between, if you want, political needs, if we look at the previous presentation, or political ideas, political vision. So the cognitive side of politics and the emotional side. So we wanted to look into these both dimensions. And we operationalized the study through applying the theory of emotion economies by Sarah Hamed, and we look at how this has been developed by the Spanish linguist Manuel Alcántara Pla, where he's focusing on discourse analysis of emotions. This is to look into the supply side. I'm going to tell a little more in a minute. And then for the demand side, we collected data through a survey with a representative sample both in Portugal and in Italy the 10 days before elections, the last one in Italy, 2022, and the 4 last one in Portugal, 2024. In the country, there were elections also last year. We then measure the response not at a cognitive level, asking how much do you agree with political facts or hypothetical scenarios that were framing different categories of studies, as you see on screen. But we asked them, what do you feel about these political facts? What do you feel about these hypothetical scenarios? I will show you the questions in a minute. And of course, they are also available on the paper. To operationalize the quantitative side, so the survey side of measuring emotions, we use the Geneva Emotion Wheel, which is an instrument that has been tested and developed in Geneva, and it collects 20 emotion families, including emotions that are both positive and negative, and that have low and high arousal. Based on these 2 dimensions, emotions are divided in 4 quadrants in the emotion wheel, and we selected 2 emotions for each of the quadrants, collecting 8 emotions in total that we gave as a possible response to survey respondents. Plus, of course, people could also indicate other emotion, and they could specify which one they wanted to indicate. Moreover, we analyzed the semi-structured interview we made with MPs sitting in the Italian and Portuguese parliament with Fratelli d'Italia, the party of the far right, currently leading the government coalition in Italy, at that time being the party candidate to be the winning party, which eventually happened. And in Portugal, the Chega party, a party that went from 1 MPs in a parliament of 230 in 2019 to being the second biggest party in 2025 with 60 MPs, and so leading the opposition now in the center-right government. So the emotion narrative as an heuristic has been operationalized. The sentence in red is quoted from the article, as emotion narratives are thus characterized by long-term social identity-related collective emotions that emerge through cognitive, affective, narrative entangled with the protection of deep objects. Sarah Ahmed explained how deep objects, in fact, how emotions circulate between subjects and objects in society. So with that, we wanted to achieve the theoretical purpose of looking at long-term emotions, both positive and negative, that entangle social and political groups, providing idealization, identification, and differentiation. And so we understand that the emotion narrative are based on the understanding that the social and political aggregation is produced through rational and emotional signification. They are not separated. And they shape the entanglement between in and out groups. And so, as I said, operationalizing Sarah Ahmed's theory through Alcántara linguistic approach, we divided the objects between deep objects that are characterized as valuable and vulnerable, and shallow objects that are characterized as being possibly a threat or an opportunity in relation to the deep objects. The entanglement between deep and shallow objects make clear which emotion is being mobilized in political discourse. And if we look at results of our analysis in the MPs interviews, we see that in both countries we have this characterization of deep objects as being the identity of the country, the homeland, liberty, security, authority, family. These are core values of the right, if you want, and they are very evident on these narratives, on the narratives within these interviews. The shallow objects that are representing threats are both bad or economic migrants, minorities, because they are diverse, because they are outnumbered, because they do not deserve our social welfare. So showing here social welfare chauvinism. And on the political side, of course, the leaders of the left were portrayed as a threat to all the deep objects, the national identity, homeland, liberty, security, authority, and family values, because they defend all their liberal battles, if you want. And the shallow objects that constitute opportunities for defending the deep objects, they are the good migrants. We asked about the difference between Ukrainians compared to other migrants. And you see on screen a little bit of the argument that is that they were true refugees, not economic migrants compared to other people reaching the shore of Italy or Portugal. But also the good shallow object is their own leader, the leader and the party, because it constitutes the proximity with the people on the ground. So you see that
3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Joni. So you see that there are both negative and positive emotions that emerge within this dynamic, and they were quite evident in the analysis. Now I'm coming to present the questions we put. I'm not going to read all of them, but just for you to have an idea, these are the political statements. We ask people to respond with an emotion. What do you think? What do you feel about knowing that Portugal or Italy is a country governed by a representative democracy and so on? So, for instance, Portugal being a member of the European Union. These are facts, and they would just respond how they feel about that. And if we look at the responses, we see that if we divide those who voted for radical right populist parties from those who voted for other parties, that may even be center-right parties. So we have the blue and the red, which are respectively the radical right voters in Portugal, the blue, and in Italy, the red. You see that when asked about Portugal is a member of the European Union, you have less pride in both cases. Joy is mixed, but you also have less admiration in Portugal, more admiration in Portugal, and in Italy, more sadness, more fear, especially in Italy, more hunger. So there is an aversion to the European Union, which is higher in Italy there. But when we look at the question 3, for instance, parties considered populist have a seat in parliament, then you see that there is more pride, more admiration, less shame, less sadness, less fear in the radical rights voters compared to the rest of the population. Then we asked about the scenarios, and so I'm just going briefly to analyze one response to the question that is Portugal being led by an authoritarian leader. What do you feel about that, or Italy? And there is more pride, more joy, more admiration or respect, less fear, less anger for this scenario. So to come to very quick conclusion, we see that the participatory culture is based on strengthening centralized executive power, representative democracy as compared to participatory democracy. There was a question on referendum, which didn't make the difference because the party and the leader represent the proximity with the people. Then, in terms of diversity, respondents outline the national exclusionary and cultural chauvinist position, asking for more rather than less security, especially against undeserving others, and the differences that exist in the last 10 seconds of my presentation between Portugal and Italy are due to the position of these two parties in the campaign, while Chega was still an outsider campaigning against the established system. the Brothers of Italy party in Italy was campaigning to win the election, so was less anti-systemic in Italy, but was more anti-European and against the European elite. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to all the presenters for fitting their work into 15 minutes. So much content, so little time. So it's greatly appreciated. So now we're going to turn to the discussants' feedback on these presentations, beginning with remarks by Justin Patch.
So I sort of seem like an odd one out here, given that I write about art and music and political campaigns, but there are some things that pop up in all of these. And so I'll start with Chara, with yours. And to me, there's a really interesting sort of artistic angle here in that what I see in this particular moment, I think, you and I both living in the States and watching this moment, is a combination of two arts that play on the notion of believability. The most obvious one is video editing. And the way that that video is done, if you are a historian of film, what you see are tricks that were used in the 70s when there were no special effects. And so what we see in some ways is an appropriation of a kind of an artistic practice that goes back to the Renaissance, where you're tricking the eye into believing something, right? It is perspective. It is the use in the Renaissance of mathematics from the Middle East to give an illusion of something being real. So perspective in the Middle East is science. Perspective in the Renaissance becomes about grandeur. And this practice then in some ways stays with us. And it's the presentation of something otherworldly. And what we see with Eisenstein, I think, to me is one of the greats with film, is a way to use film to trick the eye. And in this case, Giuliani and his team are trying to trick the eye. And in a way, instead of instilling a kind of subjectivity that the Renaissance does with the individual, into a kind of atomization that allows for credulity to sort of sneak in and be part of this process. And so to me, as somebody who loves the arts, this kind of appropriation is something that both bothers me, but also stays with a history of how the arts are used to reinforce sort of, or to create social mechanisms. For Neva, I guess my thought about this, and sort of completely off topic, is what are the symbolic values that allow everybody, or the symbols that allow everybody to come together? I know my familiarity with the Israeli context is different. The American context for military symbolism is industrial art, probably at its finest, in the way that the American armed forces typically use the arts as a way of getting people to sort of forget their discontents and to sort of romanticize hardship. I think that the Navy does an excellent job of romanticizing hardship. And so the way that you're looking at the similar levels of dissatisfaction are the way in which the IDF sort of hangs together. I would sort of ask the question of how are those hardships romanticized to the point where secular soldiers and religious soldiers sort of see each other in this. I'm also in an interesting way reminded of Jean-Paul Sartre wrote the preface to The Wretched of the Earth. So the second publication of The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon's sort of one of his magnum opuses, has an intro by Sartre. And one of the lines that really stuck with us is Sartre said, someday we will be measured by the similarity of our needs, not by the quality of our wants, or something to that effect. And it seems like, in an interesting way, the IDF sort of hits on that, where if everybody is a little bit dissatisfied, there is a union in that sort of motion. So that's sort of what I was thinking about in terms of like how are hardships represented in a way that religious soldiers and secular soldiers see each other sort of suffering in a way that makes you feel like, okay, everybody's losing something to be here. And everything, of course, is about some form of representation. Elizabeth, this to me is a fascinating case, right? Pericles, going back to sort of thinking of who's the Michael Kazin, who talks about, populism is always a part of American democracy. And you're making a case that populism is always part of democracy, period. And I would say, like, populism being part of democracies that require warfare, which is another sort of an interesting glitch in the system that democracy, as we think about it, oddly enough, especially if you're living in the States, requires some kind of pugilism to maintain itself. And that the idea of glory in sacrifice, and that sacrifice becomes artistically presented. It's not enough to talk about glory in the loss of a child or a loved one, is that glory becomes statuary. And it becomes something that you make a pilgrimage to, that you see a kind of representation of your loved one that stands in for anybody else's loved one that shows up in a way that allows for a kind of collective identity. I also sort of, the idea of collective identity legitimizing conflict. That to me is interesting, because if we follow sort of some of the early writing on nationalism, that collective identity is always a kind of a historical leap. I'm thinking of Hobsbawm and Ranger's work, where they're like, you sort of invent a collective identity so that people can see themselves in it. And that invention is always done, at least for Hobsbawm and Ranger, in a way that is somewhat artistic, even if, Ranger's work is talking about the Highland Games. I would argue that presentation is a kind of performance art that makes people feel connected to something, allows them to quite literally see themselves in what's happening. Where are you? Cristiano. This to me, the idea of discourse and emotion, right? Emotion is the engine of politics, is the engine of democracy, despite what the Enlightenment tells us, right? I think of Drew Weston's work here, is that like emotion is always in the driver's seat. And so the deep and shallow objects to me were really interesting. And one of the things that I was thinking about here is Zygmunt Bauman's work on modernity and ambivalence. And in the book, but also in one of his articles, he writes about friendship and enmity as the two polarities in society. And that when you try to understand a society sociologically, you look at what are their friendships and what are their enmities, and where do relationships fall on that scale. And populism, at least in your reading, bends these two together, because instead of placing an object on that scale, which is how Bauman sort of sees cosmopolitanism, what populism does is it creates a circle where in that circle, you have friendship and enmity that operate at the same time. So you have these sort of what you call deep objects that exist in shallow objects. And these two have very Enlightenment connotations about identity. That one of them is the Enlightenment notion of identity from Kant, that we get that we are born with identity, and the work that we do going through education and adulthood is to get rid of all the false parts of this to reveal our true essence. The other Enlightenment notion of identity, and I think about this with Rousseau, is that you are born tabula rasa, and all the work that you do is building up to this. And the deep and shallow have interesting connotations for both of those. Like the deep identity is the one that you're born with. And so populism is a way of getting rid of the shallow things so that your true national identity can be the only identity without this sort of debris that's stacked on top of it. The thing that I think about with the arts, and I'm going to sort of refer to Dewey here. Dewey believes that art is an essential part of society, and that in order for a democracy to function, everybody has to have access to the arts. Now, Dewey is narrow in what he thinks about the arts. For him, it's literature, poetry, visual art, and music. And I think we could sort of push that out to theater and dance and all this other stuff that, is not really in Dewey's mind. But the thing that Dewey thinks about is the creation of the self through art. And that when you don't have the option of making art, of doing a kind of abstract self-representation, that you are likely to have somebody else tell you who you are, rather than the idea of deciding who you are. And that process for Dewey is about the arts. Like poetry is where you express who you are. Music is where you express who you are. And I think for me, the fact that art is missing in so many places also points to the notion that people are searching for a kind of identity. And without the ability to shape that identity for themselves, you are more likely to have an Erdogan, an Orban, a Trump tell you, this is who we are, this is who we have always been, rather than having somebody who from childhood has been able to say, this is who I am, and this is how I abstractly represent myself. And so one of the
Justin,
yes,
maybe wrap it up in a minute or so.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I sort of am looking for is the piece of the arts that pops up in all of these. How is it being used? Who is using it? And is there a countermeasure that, to look at Char's work, that sort of the weapons of the weak, is there a countermeasure that can be utilized to push back against these automatic formations, these sort of like overwhelming power that looks to create homogeneous spaces of populism?
Thank you. A lot to think about there. And let's move on to our second discussion, which is Amedeo.
Hello, everyone. I would like to thank ECPS for giving me the chance to discuss these brilliant presentations. To begin with Professor Spelisi's contribution, I was quite surprised with the amount of detail and legal theoretical depth that was used by the author to approach utilizing a semi-narrative style, a complex yet increasingly relevant discussion concerning the Freeman-Moss case. I'll make three brief observations about this presentation. Firstly, the piece tells us something about the positive role that independent organisms such as courts have and the duty that comes with the pursuit of truth, as well as the fundamental rights citizens have to not be defamed and have their reputation and lives, as we saw with the Freeman-Moss case, destroyed. Secondly, the article made me reflect on the fact that although irregularities in elections can always happen, Of course, I'm not referring to the American elections or the Freeman case, where both women were defamed by Rudy Giuliani. And there are small isolated procedural mistakes that can happen, such as clerical errors or limited fraud. This does not necessarily result in changes to the final outcome. And this is something that populists should bear in mind. Thirdly, the big lie claiming the election was stolen is interestingly enough a recurring theme in Trumpism. But interestingly enough, it's not a characteristic of populism per se, because in Europe, even radical right populists are known to concede when they lose. Think of Orban or Le Pen, for example. I would describe the Trump phenomenon as an extremification of populism, a populism that has, in the American case, the potential to transform itself into authoritarianism. As the political scientist Paul Taggart reminds us, once populism surpasses the threshold from electoral democracy or competitive authoritarianism into full-fledged authoritarian or totalitarian dictatorship, populism ceases to be populism and becomes something else, something more extreme. This hasn't occurred in America yet, but could happen. And the big lie and the Capitol Hill events led Trump to lose some of his more moderate middle-class voters, traditional Republicans who supported Ronald Reagan, the Bushes, or even McCain, do not necessarily feel represented by Trump, especially after the 2020 events. So moving on to Dr. Golan Nadir's work, I haven't had the chance to read the contribution. I only had the abstract available. I certainly would like to read it at some point. What I can say is that in representative parliamentary democracies like Israel, a certain degree of institutional dissatisfaction is entirely normal and quite common. More importantly, it is structurally embedded in how society relates to internal state actors or powerful state organs. That said, in the case of the IDF, I would assume that the IDF enjoys a strong default level of public acceptance, given it is understood to represent or be tied to national survival and national revival, perhaps under Netanyahu, at how he legitimizes it, but also the universal conscription and making the IDF a shared social institution. This makes the IDF a shared social institution rather than a detached and distant body. However, legitimacy often coexists with criticism put forward by citizens and also at times by political figures. Interestingly, it also made me think of how religious Israelis may feel the military sometimes does not promote or accommodate halachic norms enough, or even focus on the protection of religious identity, while secular Israelis take the opposite stance. For example, they criticize or oppose any religious influence in military life. So yes, there is this paradoxical dual dissatisfaction and tension that creates a particular equilibrium. Neither religious nor secular Israelis own the IDF. As a result, this, to some extent, preserves the cross-cutting legitimacy of the IDF, preventing capture of the institution by one ideological camp or any single narrow particularistic group. For further reflection, I think the question could be, will this balance endure as social divisions deepen? At what point does productive dissatisfaction become delegitimization? After all, the military remains a focal point for both identity and security. Moving on to the paper presentation by Professor Cosme-Tateau, I can certainly appreciate the contribution as it maintains a substantially relevant historical discussion from which one can subsequently draw parallels between antiquity and modernity. This is certainly a great strength of Professor Cosme-Tato's work. Learning about Pericles' funeral oration, in which he framed the Peloponnesian War as a collective civic and identitarian patriotic enterprise, which perhaps can be interpreted even as an early form of proto-palingenetic nationalist rhetoric, can remind us how contemporary populist leaders like Donald Trump have also sought to shape public opinion regarding war, for instance, by claiming he could bring the Ukraine-Russia conflict to a swift end through rapid negotiation or a quick settlement, in a somewhat analogous, although historically distant way. If I understood correctly from Professor Cosmerato's abstract, Pericles too tried to convince his people that a swift victory could be achieved. In any case, this presentation on Pericles' politics is incredibly useful to understand the contemporary political context and the dynamic that exists between popular leaders and potential popular consensus in relation to war. I believe in scholarship, Athenian democracy is often considered the first form of populistic direct democracy. However, sometimes classical leaders such as Pericles, Cleon, Hyperbolus are referred to as demagogues, and demagogy and populism do not necessarily go hand in hand always. Mainly because while populism can absolutely take demagogic forms, especially in its more ancient manifestations, its ideological or semi-ideological programmatic character today has turned populism into something much greater than pure demagogy or a strategy to elicit angry crowds, which Plato would call the many-headed monster. So linking everything back to Professor Cosmerato's work, a study of the politics in ancient Athens is certainly a study relevant to comprehend populism today. Using today's standards, Pericles certainly was a national populist. His direct appeal to the citizen body, in that case the Athenian assembly, his juxtaposition between the people and an evil other, and his idolization of the morality and other virtues of the demos confirm this. So concerning the final presentation and paper by Dr. Gianola and colleagues, where emotions of voters and representatives, MPs, are examined to shed light on the political culture of the radical right in Portugal and Italy. I won't delve too much on the conceptual framework and methodology adopted. This is clearly an insightful paper that is undeniably relevant, as emotions are probably understudied in the subfield of populism and radical right studies. It fills a gap in the literature, also because while research on Brothers of Italy, known as Fratelli d'Italia, is on the rise since Meloni became Italian prime minister and a pivotal figure in European politics, academic work in English on the Portuguese Chega is instead more limited. That said, methodology can be considered a strength of the paper. I interviewed myself during my doctoral thesis. I interviewed slightly less, a smaller number of MPs, and I know how difficult it can be. So congratulations for that. Also, having a significant amount of data gathered from surveys adds to the robustness of the method. So graphs are transparently displayed in the article for the reader, and this is also very good. I appreciate that a pretty clear definition of radical right and extreme right is provided. Today, not everybody delineates the theoretical political border between the two, distinguishing between radical and extreme right. I think this is important and adds to credibility. I also agree with the authors that there are so-called objects or themes, I would say, that accompany populism that go beyond the core, which is primarily anti-elitism. In my opinion, such themes would be on politics, sovereignism, producerism, direct democracy, and so on. I find it interesting that populism is understood by Dr. Gianola and colleagues to be a political logic instead of an ideology. The authors argue that discourse on the crisis of democracy is central to populism. I have to say I'm not so convinced about this. I think that at the very core of populist ideology, we find anti-elitism, people-centrism, and alongside anti-elitism, a critique of liberalism, often highlighting a crisis of neoliberalism rather than of democracy. which populists strongly claim to believe in. Another thing I will bring up, but please take it as a point for further reflection and not a critique by any means. I would not have used the term radical right for Brothers of Italy, because although I know many scholars still do, Alessia Donà, for example, I'm not entirely convinced that the party is today a radical right party. Their line on immigration has been softened. They are basically a party against illegal, uncontrolled immigration, which is the same exact stance of Emmanuel Macron or Keir Starmer, or of any center-right party of the European People's Party, for that matter. I think that whilst the party certainly has indirect neo-fascist roots, there has also been a significant moderation. I see them as lacking the three principal elements of nativism, authoritarianism, and populism to belong to what Cas Mud defines the radical right party family. For example, Meloni might use soft populist discourse from time to time, but I don't see any real attack on elites anymore. She is pro-NATO, essentially pro-EU, supports EU enlargement and selective integration. So there is not even any rhetoric against big banks anymore. Has a good relationship with the mainstream Brussels elite, starting with Ursula von der Leyen. She supports free markets over protectionism. So as I wrote for an article for ECPS last year, I think
one minute, please.
Okay, sure. I think that okay, I'm going to move on from this. Right. So what Janola and colleagues included was a statement by an MP regarding Ukrainian refugees. The MP makes the case that while economic migration is understandable, there has to be a limit, essentially that it has to be controlled. But they absolutely accept that Ukrainian refugees, immigrants fleeing from war, they accept refugee status for them. So perhaps this tells us something about populist parties. And this type of discourse is today often adopted or mimicked by the center-right, by parties such as the German CDU or the French Republicans. So thus two observations, and I'll conclude with this, can be made. Either the radical right today is less radical than we make them out to be on certain issues, or simply the radical right populist positions on immigration are mainstreamed by the center right, making them at least appear less toxic than they were originally. So, of course, being contenders for government leadership in several European countries, the populist right was forced to moderate some of its views. So it's tricky to really find a definitive answer to this question. Perhaps I'll let you guys decide and further reflect on this. To conclude, I really enjoyed the article by Janola and colleagues and all the other articles discussed before. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a little bit less than 20 minutes left. And during that time, we wanted to address questions from participants and then have presenters have the opportunity to respond. So, I mean, we're a small group. Everybody is visible on the same screen. So why don't we do this in a conversational manner where those of you who have been such good and attentive listeners to the presentations and the discussants, let's give you the first chance to, use the hand raise function on Zoom and ask a question if you have one. And, maybe I could lead off with a question here as people are thinking. And, one of the thoughts that I had about this is this idea of the definition of the people, as a unified entity with a common identity, and how that's been unpacked by so many of these presentations. And I'm just wondering if anybody here is familiar or has used that concept of intersectionality that was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw a decade or perhaps more ago. Is anyone familiar with Kimberly Crenshaw's work in intersectionality? Yes. Do you want to say something about that, Justin?
Well, I mean, I think there's two different kinds of populism, and I'll make the argument that there's inclusive and exclusive. And I'm going to argue if you look at the numbers behind Donald Trump, that version of populism is actually somewhat inclusive. When you look at, I mean, that coalition is falling apart. But if you look at demographics of by education, by sex, by income, by race, by geography, that it was a much bigger tent phenomenon than the Democratic Party, which always calls itself the Big Tent, was. And so I think there is a way in which populism, I think this is Ernesto Laclau, right? And populism is an empty signifier. At its best, it allows anybody to see themselves as one of the people. I think that's why Canavan, Margaret Canavan, is not, or in certain instances, Laclau and certainly Chantal Mouffe are hesitant to dismiss populism out of hand because it has the potential to let so many different people see themselves as one of the people.
Oh, thank you. Cristiano, I see your hand up.
Firstly, I want to thank the brilliant commentaries received by Justin and Amadeo, and I appreciate those, and I took very good notes. Then on this issue of intersectionality, well, we are focusing on how exclusionary populism, following the distinction made by Justin, in fact, can have this intersectional, I mean, people from different races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, classes, and so on. It can be voted from these intersectional groups of people, but at the same time, their discourse is sheerly exclusionary. So if we take the distinction made on that from Casmud and Cristobal Rovira Kaltwasser in 2013, I think, then we should characterize all the parties we have been talking about as exclusionary populist, because they purpose, differentiation between the national whiteness-based identity compared to everything else. And I think Trump is the brightest example for that. But if we want to look at inclusionary populists in discourse, I'm not saying that this disqualifies Justin Point, but I think is to see the same issue from a different angle. Then we can have, if we think of Podemos in Spain, or if we think of La France Insoumise, or generally left-wing populism, especially when it is raising and in the opposition. I'm not thinking about Maduro's Venezuela, but probably the beginning of Chavez Venezuela would be aligning with that. So there you have a more inclusionary approach, including for indigenous people when it takes on Latin America, compared to what you have in the far right. So I think this intersectional approach is interesting, precisely based on the Justin's mentioned distinction between inclusionary and exclusionary. And thank you for asking about that.
Thank you. Neva?
Yes, thank you. It was such an interesting session. And what struck me is that all presentations and all the comments have something really, really common to it. And I think that Professor Patch, in his comments, not specifically to mine, but mentioned the friend versus foe. The classical Carl Schmitt definition that politics is at the state of emergency and politics is managing enmity. So basically, in each and every one of the presentations that we've heard here today had this component of the us versus them, which I believe is in the heart of populism.
Any other comments or reflections from? Please go ahead. Yes.
Hi. Yes. Okay. Yeah, I agree with much of what was said just now. It's just that, however, I would argue that populists are always exclusive, whether they're on the right or on the left, because it just depends on who they're excluding. I mean, the radical right populists certainly exclude immigrants or other groups that do not belong to what they would describe as the homogeneous population. However, populists of the left can also exclude based on social class. And all populists are more or less anti-pluralist. So there's some are more and some are less, but all populism at some point has to be, by definition, anti-pluralist to be populist. So this is just my idea, but feel free to disagree with me.
Hey, I would like to. Oh, I see someone unmuted. Would you like to say something,
perhaps just
Christiana?
to respond
Yeah.
on this last comment, because I think this is eventually the practice of populism. When we look at the results of, I mean, even if you look at it from whatever school of thoughts on populism, if we look at how, from Mudde's definition perspective or Laclau's political logic, also, if you look at from the stylistic type or political strategy perspective, I think eventually what is the purpose of the populist leader is to embody the people, and the people cannot be distinguished. So there is a body which is the people, which represents everyone. And so I agree with the comment that eventually this is the outcome of populist politics, that, to represent a group which is indistinguished within. But the way this group can be created, at least in this course, I'm saying that the practice, I mean, the reason why even left populists were disillusioning their supporters is precisely because there is no coherence between the position they defend in theory and the political practice when they gain representation. So I fully agree. Eventually, this is the outcome, although not always it is the normative settings upon which different political phenomena set up their political discourse.
Yeah. I guess, I was wondering, why am I thinking about intersectionality at a point, in this situation of populism? And I think part of it, and again, perhaps coming from an arts background, is that in many ways it's about the individual humans, the humans who are subsumed under the people, in populism. And those individuals do have multiple identities and differing interests that have to be subsumed or erased in some way to then be part of the people. And so that's so I guess from a deeply individual level of identity, or even groups that have been marginalized in their effort to fit in under that umbrella of the people, it seems like there's a lot of tension. I think that really came up for me as I was listening to Neva, your discussion about, this is really like the multiple identity of, religion within, a country that calls itself a democracy, and needs a strong military, given the historical and geographic circumstance. So I think that's where, just to, if maybe it was out in left field, but that's what I was thinking of. Any other questions here? I'd like to specifically, oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to put out a question to our presenters.
Sure.
Is there ever the possibility of a utopian populism, or like democracy, is it always going to be couched in a struggle against something else?
Can I ask, are you referring to the period I talked about? Because I can talk about that.
Absolutely.
About utopia. Okay, so I'm aware of, well, there were discussions of utopias in classical antiquity. I'm aware of two specifically. One, of course, is the very famous polis that, the republic that Plato wanted to, well, create, which was disastrous attempt in somewhere in Syracuse. Anyway, the other one, which really discussed egalitarianism and democracy and so forth, and equality especially, but that was mostly a political trick, I think. But anyway, I originally studied the Attalids of Pergamon, who were a dynasty in the Hellenistic period that ruled over Pergamon, which is in modern-day Turkey, in Bergama today, so in ancient Mysia. And when the dynasty died out in the 2nd century, there was someone who had a background of a slave, but was free for some reason, or he wasn't really. I mean, it's a bit not certain. His name was Aristonicus. He claimed to be the long-lost son of one of the last kings of Pergamon, the most illustrious of them, Eumenes II. And he tried to lead an insurrection against the Roman rule. The Romans weren't really keen on Pergamon, but the last king of Pergamon left the kingdom virtually to the Romans. And he was childless and so forth. So this guy claims to be his long-lost half-brother. And he starts an insurrection. At first, it succeeds, but eventually not so much. The Romans had to intervene. And eventually, he created this utopic idea of a democracy comprising of slaves. So in order to have troops, he mobilized slaves. So he said, if you come with me, I'm going to free you, and we're going to create the city of the sun, Heliopolis. So, of course, he didn't live to do anything like that, because the Romans arrested him and strangled him publicly in Rome after a triumph. But that was the whole thing, the only thing I know about.
Utopia's fate. Chara, did you have your hand up? Were you?
I did.
Okay.
This reminds me of Faulkner, that the past is never dead, it's not even past. Part of this story of American democracy is still unfolding. And so I'll be both pessimistic and optimistic. So the pessimistic part is the FBI recently seized the ballots from Fulton County. There is no legal reason for this because all of the relevant criminal statutes of limitations have already run, which means I think that seizure will only be used for propaganda, which is terrifying to me. But I also think that the arts and film has a role to play in getting us out of this. And I'm very encouraged by just the citizen journalists who have been documenting what has happened in Minneapolis and other locations with ICE and Border Patrol, and that has really made a difference. We literally have a different head of Homeland Security, I think, because of those grassroots efforts. So I think we're not lost yet. We're in the we're in the woods, but I think we can get out of this, and the arts will be part of how we get out of this.
Thank you. Nate, we have 2 minutes left, so we're just about done. Does anybody have a closing comment?
One thing about the arts, of course, that will happen only if universities stop closing down departments of arts and so forth. And because there is even when it is not warranted, there is an unprecedented attack against humanities and social sciences going on by administrations, most notably by my university, among them.
Yeah, so this is, I know that we have people from many different countries, and you may be aware, but the current administration in the United States has, over the past year plus, really attempted to, at the national level, control the production of art through its control of financial resources, basically through the National Endowment for the Arts and National Endowment for the Humanities, the Smithsonian Institution, and there that has had a trickle-down effect to the states and even local municipalities. And from my perspective, it just does show what a threat the arts is to a government with authoritarian tendencies.
Although if I can push back on that a little bit, it goes to show you the short-sightedness of the governors, because they act like people make art for money, and that's not why people make art. Right. And so that taking away the financial incentive hurts a certain class of people. But I mean, I grew up in the 80s, so with graffiti, and nobody got paid to do that. Like that level of resistance and self-expression was something that people participated in because it is what they felt.
It's true. So although the NEH and the, NEA, they do a lot of small grants too for individuals and very small organizations. But generally speaking, with my foundation hat on, I have to say that the artists who are the most capable and arts organizations the most capable of speaking out are small and nimble, and the larger institutions are struggling because of their dependence on the funding. 01, so at least in Eastern Standard Time. So I'm going to turn this back to ECPS for any final comments, but I thank everyone here for an incredibly rich 2 hours. I really appreciate the thoughtfulness and the very high quality research.
Yes, thank you so much to everyone. We now come to the conclusion not only of today's session, but of the ECPS virtual workshop series, We the People and the Future of Democracy. Over the course of this journey, ECPS has organized 8 in-person sessions at Oxford University, alongside 16 virtual sessions, bringing together a remarkable community of scholars and practitioners. It has been a long yet rewarding journey, and we are deeply grateful to all who have accompanied us throughout. A special thanks goes to Sumeye Kojaman, who initiated this wonderful project, which has sparked many reflections and discussions. And dear distinguished presenters, thank you all for your insightful and stimulating contributions. I would also like to extend my sincere gratitude to our chair for thoughtful assessments and excellent moderation of the sessions, as well as to our discussants for their precise and illuminating observations. I would also like to warmly acknowledge Reka Kolezaj and Stella Shade for their invaluable contribution to the series. Again, thank you so much to all involved, because your engagement and intellectual generosity have made this series not only productive, but also truly and really meaningful. To conclude, I wish you all a wonderful day.